Hey there, night wanderers. Welcome to The Sleepy Activist, where we uncover the hidden stories of resistance, solidarity, and collective power that changed the world, one restful night at a time. Tonight we're settling in with a story about endurance, community, and survival during one of history's darkest chapters, the Black Death of the 14th century. But we're not looking at this pandemic through the eyes of kings or chroniclers. We're walking alongside the peasants, the laborers, the forgotten majority who kept civilization alive while death walked among them. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy easing into sleep through stories like this. Drop a comment below and let us know where and when you're watching. Are you wrapped in blankets, phone dimmed low? Listening in the quiet hours when the world feels still? Or maybe you're somewhere far away, finding comfort in voices from the past. Tonight's story isn't about nobility or grand gestures. It's about ordinary people facing extraordinary horror with nothing but their label-worn hands, their communal bonds, and their stubborn refusal to let their world completely collapse. It's about how the powerless found power, how the exploited demanded justice, and how a plague that killed millions also broke the chains of feudalism forever. So let your breathing slow, let your muscles relax, and let's travel back to 1348, to a small village somewhere in England where a young peasant woman named Agnes is about to witness the end of one world and the painful birth of another. Agnes wakes before dawn, as she has every day of her 23 years. The rhythm of peasant life doesn't allow for sleeping in. The Lord's fields need tending, the manor's demands are endless, and her own small plot, the strip of land that barely feeds her family, requires every spare moment she can steal from her bonded labor. Her hands are already rough and calloused, marked by years of fieldwork that began when she was barely tall enough to hold a sickle. She shares a one-room cottage with her husband William, their 3 children, William's elderly mother, and during winter months, the family's most valuable possession, a dairy cow whose body heat helps them survive the cold. This is life under feudalism, a system so totalizing that most peasants never travel more than 15 miles from their birthplace in their entire lives. Agnes is bound to this land, legally, economically, and spiritually. She cannot leave without the Lord's permission. She cannot marry without paying a fee. When she dies, her family will owe the Lord her best animal as a death tax, a heriot, even if that animal represents their only means of survival. Let's be clear about what feudalism actually meant for the 90% of medieval people who worked the land. It wasn't a romantic age of chivalry. It was a system of legally enforced exploitation, where a tiny aristocratic class extracted the majority of wealth produced by peasant labor. Agnes owes her lord 3 days of labor per week on his domain, his personal farmland. During harvest season, that obligation increases to 6 days, leaving her almost no time for her own crops. She also owes a portion of everything she produces, a tenth of her grain, eggs from her chickens, a share of her garden vegetables. She must use the Lord's mill to grind her grain and pay for the privilege. She must use his oven to bake her bread and pay for that too. She cannot hunt in the forest. All game belongs to the Lord.
She cannot gather fallen wood without permission. She cannot fish in the streams, graze her animals on certain lands, or even glean leftover grain from harvested fields without authorization. The air she breathes is free, but nearly everything else requires payment, permission, or both. Yet despite this crushing system, peasant communities developed their own forms of resistance and solidarity. They worked collectively, shared resources, and developed intricate systems of mutual aid that their lords could never fully suppress. The village commons, shared grazing land, forests, and resources represented a communal economy that existed alongside and in tension with the lord's private property. Agnes knows every family in her village. She knows who needs help bringing in their harvest when sickness strikes. She knows which widow needs firewood carried, which elderly man needs his roof patched before winter. This knowledge isn't charity, it's survival. In a world where the powerful take everything they can, the powerless survive by sharing what little remains. The village makes collective decisions about crop rotation, about when to plant and harvest, about how to maintain the common lands. These decisions happen in informal gatherings, in whispered conversations after church, in the careful navigation of a community that must present a unified face to their lord's demands while managing their own complex web of relationships and obligations. On this particular morning in early summer of 1348, Agnes has no idea that everything is about to change. Rumors had been circulating for months about a terrible plague sweeping through the continent, killing entire towns, leaving fields unharvested and cities silent. But rumors are common, and life's immediate demands don't pause for distant disasters. The first sign that something is wrong comes from a traveling merchant who passes through the village, his cart loaded with cloth from London. He mentions, almost casually, that the port cities are experiencing unusual deaths, a strange illness that brings swellings, fever, and death within days. The merchant himself looks pale, feverish. 3 days later, they find him dead on the road to the next village, his body covered in the dark swellings that will become terrifyingly familiar. Within a week, the plague reaches Agnes's village.
The Black Death didn't arrive like an invading army, with clear battle lines and heroic last stands. It crept in quietly. A neighbor's cough, a child's fever, a sudden absence at morning mass. Then it exploded. The first to die in Agnes's village is Thomas the carpenter, a man of 40 years who seemed healthy at sunset and was dead by dawn, his body marked by the grotesque buboes, swellings in the neck. The Black Death didn't arrive like an invading army with clear battle lines and heroic last stands. It crept in quietly. A neighbor's cough, the child's fever, a sudden absence at morning mass. Then it exploded. The first to die in Agnes's village is Thomas the carpenter, a man of 40 years who seemed healthy at sunset and was dead by dawn, his body marked with the grotesque buboes, swellings in the neck, armpits and groin that give the bubonic plague its name. His wife and 3 children follow within days. The village priest performs the burial rites, speaking the familiar Latin words over bodies wrapped in simple shrouds, trying to maintain the dignity of Christian death, even as panic rises. Within 2 weeks, a quarter of the village is dead or dying. The priest himself falls ill, and in a desperate act that would have been unthinkable before, Agnes and other women perform the last rites for the dying,
whispering prayers they've heard hundreds of times but never spoken themselves. The church's authority, like everything else, is crumbling in the face of mass death. The Lord's steward orders the healthy to continue working the demesne fields, but fewer and fewer peasants appear each day. Some are dead, some are caring for the dying, some have simply stopped obeying, recognizing that normal rules no longer apply when death might come tomorrow. What can the Lord do to them that the plague hasn't already done? Agnes watches the careful social order of her world disintegrate. The smith, who everyone respected, lies dead in his workshop, his tools idle. The bailiff, who collected the Lord's rents with stern efficiency, dies begging for water. The village's oldest inhabitant, a woman who remembered the great famines of previous generations and whose advice guided planting decisions, dies alone because everyone is too terrified or too busy with their own dying to sit with her. The living face impossible decisions. Do you stay to nurse your sick family, likely condemning yourself to death? Do you flee, abandoning everything you've ever known? Do you continue planting fields you might not live to harvest? Do you maintain the Lord's property when your own family is starving? Agnes makes her choice. She stays. She nurses William through 5 days of fever, watching the buboes swell and darken, holding his hand when he becomes delirious, and somehow, miraculously, he survives. Their children remain healthy, though Agnes lives in constant terror of seeing the first signs of fever in their faces. William's mother dies, and they bury her in their small garden because the churchyard is overflowing and no one is organizing proper burials anymore. The smell of death hangs over the village like a physical presence. Bodies lie where they fell because there aren't enough healthy people to bury them. Dogs and pigs roam freely, feeding on remains that would have once been carefully interred with prayers and ceremony. The social fabric that held the village together is tearing apart, not because people have stopped caring, but because survival demands a brutal calculus of who can be saved and who must be abandoned. Yet, even in this horror, Agnes witnesses acts of extraordinary courage and solidarity. A young mother with 2 healthy children takes in 3 orphans, even though more mouths to feed might mean starvation for all of them. A surviving farmer shares his seed grain with neighbors who lost everything, knowing this generosity might cost his family dearly. People who could flee to isolated farmsteads choose to stay and help their community survive. The plague doesn't discriminate based on virtue or vice, but human responses to it reveal who people truly are. Some lords flee to distant manor houses, abandoning their peasants to fate. Others stay and die alongside their workers. Some wealthy townspeople wall themselves into their homes, refusing to help anyone. Others organize relief efforts, distribute food to the starving, and nurse the sick at great personal risk. The social hierarchy that seemed so permanent, so ordained by God himself, is revealed as a fragile human construction. When the Lord's bailiff is dead and the Lord himself has fled, who enforces the labor obligations? When the priest is gone, who says the masses? When half the village is dead, who exactly is supposed to keep working for free?
As summer turns to autumn, something remarkable begins to happen alongside the ongoing tragedy. The survivors start to recognize patterns in who lives and who dies. Some families seem entirely spared, while others are completely wiped out. Some people who nurse the sick remain healthy, while others fall ill from brief contact. The randomness is terrifying, but it also creates a strange sense of fatalism mixed with determination. Agnes notices that the younger children in the village seem to recover more often than adults when they fall ill. She notices that those who had traveled to market towns and survived fevers years earlier sometimes resist the plague better. These observations, shared quietly among the women who do most of the nursing, become a kind of folk epidemiology, a way of making sense of senseless death. The practical knowledge of peasant women, so often dismissed by learned physicians and church authorities, proves more valuable than any medical theory of the time. They know to isolate the sick when possible. They know to burn contaminated bedding. They know to keep water sources clean and waste away from living areas. They cannot stop the plague, but their collective wisdom saves lives that might otherwise be lost. By late autumn, the worst seems to have passed through their village. The deaths slow from a daily horror to an occasional tragedy. Agnes's village has lost perhaps 40% of its population. Some villages lost more. Some were completely abandoned, their fields returning to wilderness, their buildings slowly collapsing into ruin. The survivors face a transformed world. There are fields with no one to work them, cottages with no occupants, tools with no owners, livestock wandering without herders, and, most importantly, there is a sudden, unprecedented shortage of labor.
Winter arrives, and with it comes the full realization of what the plague has taken and what it has, paradoxically, given. Agnes and William sit by their fire one evening, their surviving children asleep, and discuss something that would have been unthinkable a year ago. They discuss leaving. Not fleeing as refugees, but leaving to seek better conditions elsewhere. The Lord Steward has been making his rounds, attempting to enforce the old labor obligations on the survivors. But his authority rings hollow now. The Lord himself hasn't been seen since spring, having fled to a distant estate. The steward is essentially alone, trying to maintain a system that requires constant enforcement, and there aren't enough enforcers left alive. When the steward demands that William report for 6 days of labor on the domain during winter, William simply says no. Not defiantly, not with revolutionary rhetoric, just a quiet, firm refusal. He has his own fields to prepare, his own family to feed, and the Lord's fields can wait. The steward blusters, threatens, invokes ancient laws and divine authority. William remains unmoved. What will the steward do? Evict them? There are 3 empty cottages in the village already. Imprison William? The village needs every able-bodied worker just to survive the winter. The steward leaves, and William and Agnes share a look of amazed disbelief. That's it. They can just refuse. The foundations of their world are shifting beneath their feet. News travels slowly in medieval England, but it travels. By early spring of 1349, rumours circulate of extraordinary events across the kingdom. Peasants are demanding wages for work beyond their feudal obligations. Some are abandoning their lords entirely and seeking employment elsewhere. Labour shortages are so severe that even the lowest agricultural work now commands payment. In June of 1349, Agnes hears about a manor 3 miles away that's offering actual silver pennies for harvest workers. Not just food and shelter as payment, but real money. She and William discuss it for days.
Such a journey, 3 whole miles, would have required the Lord's permission in the old world. Now they simply go. The neighboring lord is desperate. His population has been even harder hit than their village. Fields that should be planted are lying fallow. He needs workers, and he's willing to pay. Agnes and William negotiate, an extraordinary word for peasants to use, and agree to terms. They'll work the harvest season for wages, returning to their own village afterward. This is the moment when everything truly changes. Not the plague itself, but this moment when ordinary peasants realize they have power. The plague created the conditions, but Agnes and William and thousands like them make the choice to use those conditions to demand better lives. The summer of 1349 sees what amounts to a spontaneous general strike across much of England. Peasants simply stop showing up for unpaid labor obligations. They demand wages, better conditions, security of tenure. The old system of feudal bonds, already weakened by the plague, begins to crack under the pressure of coordinated resistance. King Edward III, alarmed by reports of peasant demands and labor shortages threatening the realm's food supply, issues the Ordinance of Labourers in June 1349, followed by the Statute of Labourers in 1351. These laws attempt to fix wages at pre-plague levels, forbid workers from leaving their manors to seek better pay elsewhere, and punish anyone who pays above the legally mandated rates. The laws are almost immediately ignored by everyone. Lords secretly offer higher wages to attract workers from neighboring manors. Peasants move freely, knowing their labor is valuable enough that no lord will turn them away for fear of losing workers to a competitor. The legal framework of feudalism remains on the books, but the economic reality has fundamentally changed. Agnes experiences this transformation personally. By 1350, she and William have accumulated actual savings, silver pennies earned from wage labor. They've never had money before, not real money. Everything was subsistence farming, payment in kind, endless cycles of obligation and debt. Now they have coins that represent choice, mobility, possibility. They use some of their savings to buy better tools, a proper iron plough that they own, not borrow from the Lord. They repair their cottage properly, with purchased materials rather than scavenged scraps. They eat better, with occasional meat and white bread, instead of the endless dark bread and pottage that had been their diet. These small improvements represent enormous changes in their lived experience. But the most important change is psychological. Agnes begins to think of herself differently. She's not just a peasant bound to the land, defined entirely by her obligations to the Lord and the Church. She's a worker whose labor has value in a market. She has choices, however limited. She has the power to negotiate, to refuse, to leave if conditions are intolerable. This shift in consciousness, multiplied across millions of peasants, is perhaps the plague's most revolutionary legacy. The survivors haven't just inherited empty farms and available land. They've inherited a world where their labor is scarce and therefore valuable, where the old mechanisms of control have been disrupted, where new possibilities exist that were unimaginable before. The village commons, always important, becomes even more crucial to peasant solidarity. Without the Lord's constant supervision, the surviving villages make collective decisions about resource management, crop rotation, and mutual support. They develop informal systems of local governance that fill the vacuum left by weakened feudal authority. Agnes participates in village assemblies, where matters are discussed and decisions made by consensus. Women's voices,
always present but often marginalized, gain more weight in a world where every worker matters and traditional hierarchies have been disrupted. The gendered division of labor remains, but the value of women's work in fields, in households, in maintaining community bonds becomes more openly acknowledged. By 1351, Agnes is in her late 20s, and the world of her childhood seems impossibly distant. She remembers the fear and deference with which her parents treated the Lord and his officials. She remembers believing that the social order was natural and unchangeable, ordained by God and enforced by immutable law. She knows better now. The plague years have taught her that social systems are human creations, vulnerable to disruption, changeable through circumstance and collective action. This knowledge, spread across a generation of survivors, creates the conditions for more conscious and organized resistance in the decades to come.
The years following the immediate plague crisis see a complex dance between peasant assertion and aristocratic reaction. The ruling class, having survived the plague, is determined to restore the old order. The peasantry, having tasted freedom and gained economic leverage, is equally determined to maintain and expand their gains. Agnes's children grow up in this contested world. Her eldest daughter, Margaret, born just before the plague, comes of age in the 1360s. She has dim memories of the dying time, but her formative experiences are of the afterworld, where peasants negotiate with lords and labor has recognized value. Margaret marries a young man from a neighboring village, a marriage arranged not by feudal obligation, but by mutual attraction and practical economic calculation. They establish a household on land that had been abandoned during the plague, asserting customary rights that would have been difficult before. The lord, desperate for any workers to make the land productive, accepts their tenancy on relatively favorable terms. This pattern repeats across England and Europe. The generation that survives the plague creates families under different conditions than their parents knew. They have more economic security, more bargaining power, more sense of their own worth and rights. They pass these attitudes to their children. But the aristocracy adapts too. As the immediate labor shortage eases, population slowly recovering, the crisis atmosphere fading, lords and their officials work to reassert traditional controls. They employ the courts more aggressively to enforce feudal obligations. They use the statute of laborers to prosecute workers who demand high wages or move without permission. They attempt to roll back the gains peasants made during the crisis years. Agnes, now in her 40s, watches these developments with growing frustration. The freedom she and William seized in the dark years after the plague is being systematically attacked by legal and economic pressure. The lords want their old world back, and they're willing to use every tool at their disposal to get it. Local conflicts multiply. A village collectively refuses to perform labor services, citing the devastation of the plague and their need to focus on their own lands. The lord takes them to court. The villagers lose the legal case but continue to resist, working slowly, producing less, finding endless excuses. It's not open rebellion, but it's not obedience either. It's the kind of everyday resistance that peasants have always practiced, but now with greater coordination and consciousness of shared interests. By the 1360s, new tensions emerge. The ongoing 100 Years' War with France requires increased taxation. The royal government, aristocratic in character and sympathetic to landed interests, sees peasants as a resource to be extracted from, not as subjects with legitimate grievances. Poll taxes, taxes levied equally on every person regardless of ability to pay, placed disproportionate burdens on poor labourers while barely affecting wealthy landowners. Agnes and her community feel squeezed from multiple directions. The Lord wants increased rents and renewed labour obligations. The Church demands its tithes. The Crown imposes new taxes to fund distant wars that bring no benefit to common people. The economic leverage they gained after the plague is being systematically eroded by coordinated pressure from above. Yet resistance continues and evolves. Peasants become more legally savvy, finding advocates who can argue their cases in manorial and royal courts. They develop networks of communication across villages, sharing information about tactics, successful resistance strategies, and lords who treat their tenants well versus those who exploit them aggressively. Agnes notices travelling preachers speaking in village squares about equality before God, about the corruption of wealthy churchmen, about how the social order contradicts Christian teachings of universal brotherhood. These ideas aren't new. Radical Christianity has always contained egalitarian elements, but they're being expressed more openly now, finding more receptive audiences. One preacher in particular, whose name varies in different accounts but is remembered in Agnes's region as Father John, speaks words that lodge in people's minds. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? The implication is clear and radical. Social hierarchy isn't natural or God-ordained, but artificial, a human creation that can be challenged. By the 1377, tensions have built to a breaking point. A new poll tax is announced, more burdensome than previous ones. Royal tax collectors move through the countryside, assessing each person, demanding payment that many simply don't have. Stories circulate of collectors extorting additional money, of cruel enforcement, of people imprisoned or having their property seized for inability to pay. Agnes is now over 50, her body worn by decades of labour, but her mind sharp and her memory long. She remembers the plague years clearly. She remembers the lords fleeing while peasants stayed and maintained civilization. She remembers the brief window when workers had power and dignity. She sees her children and grandchildren facing renewed exploitation, and something hardens in her. When tax collectors arrive in her village in spring of 1381, they meet unexpected resistance. The villagers claim they've already paid. They produce receipts, possibly forged, possibly genuine. The collectors can't tell. They obstruct the assessment process, claiming confusion about who lives where, who owns what, who counts as taxable. The collectors, frustrated and behind schedule, resort to intimidation. This is the spark. In the particular chemistry of 1381 England, decades of rising expectations meeting renewed oppression, a generation that experienced freedom facing its systematic removal, widespread communication networks among peasant communities, radical religious ideas circulating widely, this spark ignites a fire.
The Peasants Revolt of 1381 explodes across southeast England in late May and early June. It's not carefully planned or coordinated by a central leadership. It's a largely spontaneous uprising, emerging from thousands of local grievances, decades of accumulated resentment, and a shared recognition that change is possible if people act together. Agnes's village is not at the centre of the revolt. That distinction belongs to Kent and Essex, where the uprising begins. But news travels faster than anyone expects. Peasants are rising. They're refusing to pay taxes. They're marching on London. They're demanding an end to serfdom, fair rents, punishment for corrupt officials, and access to common lands that have been enclosed by the wealthy. Agnes's sons debate joining the march. It's a dangerous decision. Rebellion against the king and the established order is treason, punishable by death. But continuing as they are, watching their gains from the plague years systematically stripped away, seems like a different kind of death, a slow strangulation of hope and dignity. They decide to go. William, too old for such a journey, supports their decision, but stays behind with Agnes. Before they leave, Agnes speaks to them words she's never articulated before, but has learned through a lifetime of experience. Your labor built this world. The lords contribute nothing but extraction and violence. You owe them no loyalty, no obedience, beyond what they can compel by force. Stand with your fellows, demand what's right, and if they offer promises in exchange for your return home, get it in writing, and don't trust their word. The rebels converge on London from multiple directions, their numbers swelling as they march. They're surprisingly disciplined at first, targeting specific officials known for corruption, destroying legal documents that record feudal obligations, opening prisons to free those imprisoned for poaching or inability to pay debts. They're not a mindless mob, but people with specific grievances and specific demands. The young king, Richard II, only 14 years old, meets with rebel representatives at Mile End and Smithfield. The rebels present their demands: abolition of serfdom, fixed fair rents, access to common lands, punishment for corrupt officials, and general pardons for all involved in the rising. The king, surrounded by armed presence and fearful for his life, makes promises. But even as promises are made, the revolt is being betrayed. The adult nobles surrounding the king have no intention of honoring agreements made under duress. They're buying time, gathering forces, preparing to crush the rebellion once the immediate threat passes. The rebel leader, Wat Tyler, is killed at Smithfield, struck down during negotiations, in a moment that remains disputed. Was it provoked? Was it planned assassination? The sources disagree, but the result is clear. With their most visible leader dead, the revolt begins to fracture. Royal forces and loyal nobles begin systematically hunting down rebels and punishing rebel villages. The promises made at Mile End are declared void. Rebel leaders are executed in gruesome public displays meant to terrorize others into submission. The uprising is suppressed, though it takes weeks of violent repression to fully extinguish the rebellion across different regions. Agnes's sons return home weeks later, exhausted and disillusioned, but alive. They saw the king make promises. They saw those promises betrayed. They saw the power of collective action and the brutal response of threatened elites. They survived, but many didn't. In the immediate aftermath, the revolt appears to be a complete failure. Its leaders are dead, its participants punished, its demands rejected. Royal authority is reasserted, feudal obligations reinforced, and the legal status of peasants unchanged. The chroniclers, writing from aristocratic perspectives, describe the revolt as a criminal outbreak that was justly suppressed. But something fundamental has changed, something that can't be undone by executions or legal pronouncements. The rebels demonstrated that peasants could organize across regions, could articulate political demands, could directly confront royal authority. They showed that the system's stability depends on their acquiescence, and that acquiescence can be withdrawn. More importantly, the economic forces that gave peasants leverage after the Black Death continue to operate regardless of the revolt's political defeat. Lords still need workers. Workers still have options. The market for labor still favors workers more than it did before the plague. No amount of legal compulsion can fully override these economic realities.
Agnes lives another decade after the revolt, dying peacefully in her cottage in 1391, surrounded by children and grandchildren. She's witnessed more change in her 66 years than most people across many generations. She was born into a world where feudalism seemed eternal and unchangeable. She dies in a world where it's clearly dying, though its final death throes will last another century. The transformation she witnessed continues long after her death. Serfdom doesn't end suddenly with a dramatic proclamation, but gradually fades as economic forces and continued resistance make it unworkable. By the mid-15th century, most English peasants are free tenants or wage labourers rather than bound serfs. The legal framework of feudalism persists longer in some regions, but its practical reality has been hollowed out. This transformation occurs across Europe, with regional variations. In England, the combination of plague depopulation, sustained peasant resistance, and a growing cash economy largely ends serfdom by 1500. In Western Europe generally, similar patterns emerge. In Eastern Europe, paradoxically, serfdom intensifies as lords respond to labour shortages by legally binding peasants more tightly, a regional difference with profound historical consequences. The world Agnes's great-grandchildren inherit is recognisably different from the one she was born into. Cities have grown, trade has expanded, social mobility has increased, and the power of aristocratic landholders has declined relative to the late medieval period. None of this was inevitable. All of it resulted from specific historical forces: the plague, economic changes, and, crucially, the sustained resistance and agency of ordinary people demanding better lives. The story we often tell about the transition from feudalism to capitalism focuses on economic forces, demographic changes, and technological developments. These matter, but they don't operate automatically. They create possibilities and pressures, but human agency determines how those forces manifest in actual social relations. Agnes and millions like her made choices. They chose to demand wages rather than accepting unpaid feudal obligations. They chose to move to manors offering better terms rather than accepting whatever their birth lord offered. They chose to resist collectively rather than submitting individually. They chose to risk rebellion when the alternative was returning to bondage. These choices, multiplied across decades and regions, transformed their world. This is the lesson that Agnes's story teaches, the insight that connects medieval peasant resistance to modern labor movements, anti-colonial struggles, and all movements for human dignity and freedom. Systems of exploitation require constant maintenance and enforcement. They depend on the complicity or resignation of those being exploited. When enough people withdraw that complicity, when they recognize their collective power and act on it, even the most solid-seeming structures can crumble. The Black Death created conditions for change by disrupting the demographic and economic foundations of feudalism. But the plague alone didn't end serfdom. What ended it was the sustained, often uncoordinated, but collectively powerful resistance of ordinary people refusing to return to the old ways, insisting on their value and dignity, demanding better treatment, and occasionally rising in open rebellion when pressed too far.
As you drift deeper into sleep, let Agnes's story settle into your thoughts. She wasn't a hero in the traditional sense,
She didn't lead armies or write treatises. She didn't become famous or even historically recorded as an individual. But she and millions like her changed the world more profoundly than most kings or generals. They endured plague that killed half their communities. They nursed the dying when lords fled. They kept fields planted and villages functioning when social structures collapsed. They recognized their own power in the aftermath and used it to demand better lives. They resisted patiently and persistently when elites tried to restore the old oppression. And they passed to their children and grandchildren a world with more freedom, more possibility, more dignity than they themselves had known. This is what solidarity means, not abstract ideals or grand gestures, but the practical daily work of building and maintaining communities, supporting one another through crisis, recognizing common interests, and acting collectively when necessary. The peasants who endured the Black Death didn't have the vocabulary of class struggle or human rights. They had their lived experience, their shared suffering, and their stubborn insistence on being treated as human beings. Tonight, as you rest, remember that every freedom you enjoy, every right you hold, was won by ordinary people making extraordinary choices. The weekend, the 8-hour workday, child labor laws, occupational safety standards, the minimum wage, none of these existed naturally. All were fought for by people whose names we don't remember, but whose legacy we inherit. Agnes would recognize the struggles we face today. The powerful still extract wealth from the labor of the many. Crises still reveal which leaders serve the common good and which serve only themselves. Change still comes primarily through collective action from below, not enlightened benevolence from above. The specific forms differ, but the fundamental dynamics remain. So rest well, night wanderers. Rest in the knowledge that you're part of a long tradition of ordinary people creating extraordinary change. Rest knowing that systems that seem permanent are actually fragile, dependent on our acceptance. Rest knowing that solidarity, mutual aid, and collective action have transformed the world before and can do so again. Sweet dreams. And remember Agnes, who survived plague, endured exploitation, resisted oppression, and helped build a freer world for those who came after. Her story isn't boring history, it's the story of how change happens, always has, and always will. Sleep well.